All right, welcome back to the Deep Dives. Today, we're diving into something pretty fundamental, really. How do we actually remember all this stuff we're learning? You sent in some really interesting research, and this one idea that just kept popping up, it's called, what do they call it? Retrieval practice. It's this idea that if you really want to learn something, you got to actively try to remember it. It sounds a bit counterintuitive, right? So let's unpack that a bit. What does the research say about retrieval practice?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. And you know what? This is a really surprisingly robust area of research. Scientists have been looking at this for like over a century, over 100 years. They've been looking at this idea of recall, the power of recall. And the thing that's really cool is how consistent the findings are. Actively trying to retrieve information, it's not just a way to test yourself. It actually seems to be a powerful learning tool in itself. You ever notice that? Like when you're trying to remember somebody's name and you're really struggling to bring it to mind, it makes it much more likely that you'll remember it the next time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
It's like your brain has to work harder, and that effort just somehow cements the information better. That's basically the principle we're going to be exploring today.
right. Exactly. Makes total sense. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into whether this retrieval practice thing actually holds up in the real world, specifically in classrooms. Because, a lot of research is done in these really controlled lab settings, but we want to see if it works where most of us do most of our formal learning, right? And if it does work, then what does that mean? What are the key takeaways for you, the listener, out there trying to navigate a world full of information?
Totally. And to do that, we've focused on a really valuable piece of research. There's this great review, a comprehensive review of studies that look specifically at retrieval practice, but they looked at how it's used in real classrooms, not just the lab.
That's key, right?
Yeah.
Because what works in a lab, a very controlled environment, it might not always play out the same way when you've got 30 students, a bell ringing every 45 minutes, and all the other stuff that makes up a typical classroom.
Yeah.
So where do we even start with all of this? This research goes back over 100 years, right? Did the early scientists kind of have an inkling that this might be a useful technique?
It really is fascinating how that early intuition, the power of recall, it's just been supported and refined by more recent research. There was this pivotal study back in 2006 by researchers Roediger and Karpix.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that one.
Yeah, they found that college students who actively recalled information from these text passages, they actually remembered the information a lot better, way better over time, compared to students who just passively reread the passages. So that study, it really kind of re-energized this whole focus on retrieval practice as this fundamental learning mechanism.
Okay, so that was in a controlled setting. But as we're focusing on what about actual classrooms?
Yeah.
It sounds like researchers have been increasingly moving out of the lab and into real-world learning environments. Like you said, elementary schools all the way up through medical school, tons of subjects, right?
Yeah, totally. Research has expanded so much in these applied settings. But even when you look at just classroom-based research, there's still a lot of variation, right? Studies differ in terms of what the learning materials are, whether it's online or in person, if it's individual work or group work, just all sorts of variables. That's actually why the review we focused on is so great. They took a really specific, rigorous approach.
So they tried to narrow it down to get a much clearer picture, cut through all that noise.
Exactly, yeah. They really focused on studies that had individual students engaging in retrieval practice during class time, and really importantly, using materials that were directly related to what they were studying in that course. And it all had to happen in a face-to-face classroom setting.
So no online stuff.
Right. So with all those criteria, they could create this much more direct apples-to-apples comparison of how retrieval practice really works. And you know what? It gives us, I think, much more targeted insights, not just for educators, but importantly, for you, the listener, as a learner.
Yeah, that's the goal. That makes a ton of sense. So to do all this, they had to go through, a ton of research, right?
They started by looking at nearly 2,000 abstracts. These are like the summaries of potential studies, and they had to really filter it down.
2,000, wow.
After applying all those criteria, they ended up with 50 experiments from 37 different studies that met all their requirements.
Wow, from 2,000 down to 50.
Yeah.
That's serious filtering. All right, so the big question, the one we've all been waiting for.
Yeah.
Does this retrieval practice thing actually work in real classrooms? What did they find?
Well, the overall conclusion was a very clear yes. I mean, they found consistent evidence that retrieval practice has a positive impact on student learning across different education levels and subjects they investigated. I think it's kind of like a mental workout that seems to lead to better learning.
Well, that's great news. How big of an impact are we talking here? Like, how much does retrieval practice actually seem to help?
Well, when they analyzed the results from all those 50 experiments, the majority, a good 57%, showed what they call medium to large positive effects of retrieval practice. And what's also really interesting is that only a very small number of instances, just 3 out of 49, these are called effect sizes, actually suggested a negative effect.
Meaning it didn't work.
Yeah, in those very few specific situations, the comparison group, the ones who didn't use retrieval practice, they actually performed a little bit better.
Interesting. So it's not 100% foolproof.
Right. But the trend is definitely overwhelmingly positive.
So retrieval practice is generally a good thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, you mentioned different education levels. Were the benefits pretty consistent across all of them? Did it work equally well for, middle schoolers and college students?
Actually, no. That's one of the interesting findings. The largest positive effects were actually seen in middle school settings. But there's a bit of a caveat there we should mention. A good chunk of those studies came from just a single school district. So we have to be a little careful about generalizing too broadly from that finding.
Right. Maybe there was something unique about that district.
Exactly. Now, at the undergraduate level, they found smaller average effect sizes, but those studies tended to have a lot more students involved, so there was a trade-off there, maybe a little less of an effect on average, but a much larger sample size, so maybe, more reliable in a way. And then at the medical school level, things were a bit more all over the place, with effects ranging from small to large.
I see. A very nuanced picture. How about subjects? Did retrieval practice seem to work better for some types of learning than others?
That's another area where more research would be great. The review highlighted that most of the research so far has been done in science and psychology courses, so there's definitely a need for more investigation into how retrieval practice works in other subjects, especially things like learning practical skills, mathematics, humanities, foreign languages. You can imagine how recalling vocabulary words in a new language could be really beneficial, but we just need more research on it in classroom settings.
Right, that makes sense. We're always saying more research,
Yeah.
but it's true. So let's compare retrieval practice to what we might consider, I don't know, more typical teaching practices, like just rereading material or sitting through lectures. How does it stack up?
Yeah, good question. In general, the review found that retrieval practice was more effective for students compared to those who just reread material or those who went to lectures without any sort of quizzing or recall activities.
So just passively listening to someone talk, it's not as good.
Yeah, not as effective as actually actively trying to recall the information.
You got to get your brain sweating a bit.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it seems like there's pretty good evidence that this active recall thing, it's a good strategy. But I imagine there are some nuances, some details that matter. What are some of the things that seem to influence how well retrieval practice actually works in the classroom?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are a bunch of factors that can play a role. Let's start with the timing and how often retrieval practice is used. So most of the studies looked at retrieval practice happening at least once a week or every 2 to 3 weeks. What's interesting is they saw benefits across that whole range, suggesting you don't need to do it every single day. You've got some flexibility in terms of how often you do it.
So it's not about cramming it in constantly.
Exactly. It seems like even spacing it out, it can still be really effective. Another interesting finding is about that time delay, the time between when you do the retrieval practice and then when you have, say, the final test, or when you actually need to use that information. So the review found that shorter delays, like 1 to 3 days, actually showed larger benefits, which is kind of counterintuitive.
Oh, really? Why is that interesting? Well, because some research in those more controlled lab settings suggested the opposite, like longer delays lead to better retention longer term. But this review found that these shorter delays, 1 to 3 days, worked better in classrooms.
That is counterintuitive. What do you think is going on there? Why the difference?
Well, one explanation could be that in typical classrooms, the natural delays between, when you learn something and then when you're tested on it, like maybe you have a weekly quiz and then a final exam at the end of the semester, those delays are already pretty substantial
Yeah, that's real life.
compared to the shorter delays they often use in those lab studies. So maybe that means the benefit of adding even longer delays in a classroom setting, it's just not as pronounced.
Right. Okay, so how about the way we actually try to remember information?
Yeah.
Like, if you're testing yourself, Does it matter what format you use? Multiple choice, just writing down what you remember, that kind of thing. And does it matter if the format matches how you'll eventually be tested, like on an exam, for instance?
Yeah, really good point. This gets into something called transfer appropriate processing. It's a mouthful. Basically, the idea is that you want the way you practice to match the way you'll eventually need to use the information. So the review found that the benefits of retrieval practice were generally larger when the format of the retrieval practice, like how you were testing yourself, matched the format of the final test. So, think about it like preparing for a performance. If you know you have to give a presentation, practicing by speaking out loud, that's probably more effective than just writing notes, right?
Right.
So if you know you're going to have a multiple choice test, practicing recall with multiple choice questions, probably a good idea.
Match the formats. Makes sense.
Now, it is worth pointing out that in about half of the studies they looked at, the questions on the final test were actually rephrased compared to the retrieval practice questions. And when that happened, they did see slightly smaller positive effects. This is really interesting because it highlights this idea of knowledge transfer. Just because you can recall something in one specific way doesn't necessarily mean you can apply it or even understand it when it's presented in a different way, even a slightly different way.
That's really important. Yeah, I know I've definitely fallen into that trap. All right, how about feedback? When we're learning, we need to know if we're on the right track. We need some feedback. What did the research say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of us, we crave feedback, right? It turns out it's pretty important in retrieval practice, too. Almost all of the studies they looked at, they provided immediate feedback to students after they did the retrieval practice. But here's the interesting part. In the handful of studies that didn't provide feedback, they saw much smaller positive effects, sometimes very small. So it seems like just knowing if you remembered something correctly, it really matters. However, the review didn't really dive into the best timing or type of feedback, so more research is needed there too.
As always. So feedback is good, but we need to figure out the details. What about, I guess what we could call the stakes? Does it matter if these retrieval practice activities are graded or if they're just for practice? Sometimes the pressure of a grade can really make us focus.
Actually, that's one of the most encouraging findings, I think. The review found that retrieval practice was helpful, it was beneficial, regardless of whether it was graded or not. It really suggests that the act of trying to recall information, it's just powerful in itself, even without the motivation of a grade.
Oh, that's good news for teachers who maybe don't want to add more quizzes and tests. Now, one last thing I wanted to touch on. The review mentioned where these studies took place, and it seems like there's a bit of an imbalance geographically.
Yeah, definitely something to be aware of. A striking 94% of the studies they looked at were done in what researchers call weird countries.
Hmm.
Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries.
So basically North America, Europe, places like that.
Pretty much, yeah. Only a very small number came from non-weird countries.
Why is that important?
Well, it raises the question of how much we can generalize from these findings, right? We have a ton of evidence suggesting that retrieval practice works in these weird contexts, but we don't have nearly enough evidence to say for sure if the benefits are the same in other cultures or if the most effective ways to do it are the same. Different cultures might have different norms around learning, different teaching styles, and even different ways of approaching memorization and recall.
Right. So the way retrieval practice works, it might be influenced by cultural factors.
Potentially, yeah. So we really need more research in more diverse settings before we make global recommendations.
More research. It's the theme of the day. Okay, so we've gone through a lot of the details, but let's bring it back to you, the listener. What does all of this mean for you, someone out there trying to learn and remember information in your everyday life?
The main takeaway, it's actually quite simple. If you really want to learn something, actively try to recall it, try to remember it while you're learning it. It's such a powerful strategy, both for understanding the material better and for remembering it longer.
So it's not just passively absorbing information, it's about active engagement, right?
Exactly. It's a much more active process.
And this isn't just for students in school, right?
Oh, definitely not. This applies to any kind of learning. Getting ready for a big presentation, trying to learn a new skill, exploring a new hobby, anything. If you're learning, retrieval practice can help.
And it sounds like you don't need to get super hung up on all the specific details. Just the act of recalling is the key thing.
Yeah, the research seems to show that while, like we talked about, the timing and the format and feedback, Those things matter, but the most important thing is just the act of trying to retrieve that information, to remember it. You can get creative with it.
So what are some ways people can start using this right away?
Well, you can do things like if you're reading a book or an article or even listening to a podcast, just pause every now and then
Hmm.
and try to summarize the key points just in your own words.
Without looking.
Right, without looking. You can even make your own little quizzes or
Oh yeah,
flashcards.
flashcards are a classic.
Yeah, they work. And even just thinking back to a conversation you had or notes you took, try to remember the main ideas without looking. That's retrieval practice.
And remember, we talked about matching the format of the practice with how you'll eventually use the information. So if you need to be able to explain something to someone else, practice recalling it by talking out loud. If you need to use the information to solve a problem, then try practicing the steps involved in solving that type of problem.
Exactly. Yeah, really good point. And think about the timing. Like, if you need to remember something for a presentation next week, you might want to do a few short retrieval sessions over the next few days. But if you want to remember something for, months or years down the road, then spacing out your retrieval practice over longer intervals might be better.
So to wrap all this up, it seems like retrieval practice is a really powerful tool. It's backed by research, and it's something that anyone can use.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a simple strategy, but it can really make a huge difference in how effectively you learn and how well you remember things.
So the question for you, the listener, is how are you going to use this?
Yeah.
What are some ways you can incorporate retrieval practice into your own life, your learning routine, starting today?
We've shown you the power of active learning. Now it's up to you to go out there and actually use it, experiment with it, find what works for you. Maybe this episode has sparked some questions about your own learning process, and that's great. Keep those questions in mind as you explore this really powerful technique, retrieval practice.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.